Good morning, everybody. Very good. We continue in Matthew today, and we get more parables. But today we get a string of parables. Boom, 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 boom. And it would be a little too hard for me to talk about all of them, so I'm going to pick one. And it's one you probably don't hear about a lot, the one about the woman making bread. Now, this is a short, one-sentence parable, but even though it is short, it is still a very rich story. Now, Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened." And first, of course, I'm going to give you a little context, as I always do. Who here has ever baked bread from scratch? Yeah? Okay. So yeast, here in the story, yeast is not like yeast now. We go to the grocery store and buy little packets of yeast in the fridge section, right? And then we put it in. And then you let the dough sit in a dark place and it rises up. That's called fermentation, right? We know that. But back then, they didn't have yeast packets at the grocery store. Yeast came from, and still comes from, the air. So in order to get yeast, they had to leave the dough out for a very long time. And it would become rotten and stinky and sour. So what they would do is, every time they made a batch of bread, they would keep a small piece of dough out before they bake it. And this is called the leaven. Then they would put that little piece of dough in a dark, cool place until the next time they needed to make bread. And then they would put that little piece of gross dough into the new flour. And then the yeast would ferment and spread through the whole batch. And you can still get bread made this way. It's called sourdough. Now, interesting thing about yeast and sourdough bread is that if you get sourdough bread made in New York, it's not going to taste the same as sourdough bread made in San Francisco because it's different yeast in the air. And in Belgium, they make this great beer called framboise, which is like a fruity beer. But they still make it the old way with open fermentation tanks. So they leave the beer out, and then the yeast goes in naturally. So you can only make that type of beer in one specific region of Belgium because it's the only place that that yeast is. So it's a very interesting thing, yeast. And yeast was amazing back then, kind of a wonder. Today we have microscopes and things, and we can look at the yeast and see what it's doing. But it was a great mystery back then. So you take this little rotten, stinky piece of dough, put it in the new flour, and what you get is this delicious, life-giving bread. And in this parable, the woman adds the leaven to 3 measures of flour, which is enough flour to make bread for around 100 people. So that's a lot of bread. So this parable can be interpreted to mean, from small beginnings comes a mighty kingdom. And that's one great way of looking at the parable. But there's always different ways. Now, Jesus and Paul have used leaven in other places in the New Testament, but it always has a negative meaning. Jesus uses the leaven to talk about the corruption of the Pharisees and evil and how it spreads through the people. But here, Jesus takes this negative idea and he turns it into a positive idea. He's flipping things around on us like he likes to do. The leaven grows. The yeast makes bread. But you can't see the yeast working with your eyes. It's all around us. It's in the air. It's in the dough. The yeast is always working, constantly fermenting, even if we don't see it. So Jesus, on one hand, is talking about how God's hand might God's hand might not appear to be working in the world, but it is. God's kingdom infiltrates and grows and is invasive. It sneaks up on us when we least expect it. The kingdom creeps past all of our boundaries and creates something new in us, something unexpected. Another key point to this parable is that it's in the present tense. It's happening now. The leaven is working now, constantly. Jesus isn't talking about some future date when something's going to happen. He's talking about our lives now. We are always fermenting and growing and changing. So on one hand, the leaven has a bad connotation. It's used to represent the darkness of society and how corruption and evil can infect people. But on the other hand, it also is amazing. It grows. It makes life-giving bread. Now think about the cross. We have crosses everywhere. There's one right here. And I'm sure some of us wear crosses on our necks, right? But what is the cross? The cross is an instrument of death, a horrible death, very painful, that Jesus endured for us. But it also is positive, because through the death, we know resurrection, and we know life, and we know God's grace. Thomas Keating wrote that the kingdom consists in finding God in our disappointments, in our failures, our problems, and even our inability to rid ourselves of vices. It may take some disappointment, some tragedy, illness, loss of friends, and near-death experiences to shake us free. But hope is the grace that trusts God in the midst of everydayness. So this is the leaven, this is the cross. From the old rotten dough and from all of our failures and flaws, we can grow and fully experience the kingdom. Now at the end of the story, Jesus asked the disciples if they understood all that. And of course they say yes, but I think no. But you know what? It doesn't matter if you understand it or not. We don't have to understand parables. They're not really meant to be understood because they have multiple meanings. Every time I read a parable, I can see something new and different in it. And whatever stage of life I'm in, it means something different to me. So this parable isn't really explaining what the kingdom is like, more as it is assuring us that the kingdom exists. Because even when it seems like nothing's going on, it's always working. Now in the leaven we see the profane become holy, the ugly become beautiful, and we know that from darkness comes light. And we don't know exactly how the kingdom of God works, but we know that it is working. It's working in us, with us, and through us, just like the yeast. But I'll stop talking now, because today we're baptizing two little ones, as you can hear up here. They're not too happy with my sermon today, I don't think. And God's hand is at work even through them, as small as they are. And even from these little ones, we know that great things will grow. And it all starts today. So without further ado, let's do it.